Hi, everyone, and welcome to Codicology 3.3. This is the final unit for this week, and we are going to talk about scribal and reader-added methods of glossing and annotating manuscripts. So let me start our PowerPoint. Like Codicology 3.2, this is not going to be a particularly long lecture. This is also covered in to some degree in the Clemens and Graham textbook. So we don't have to spend a whole lot of time describing all of the ways that manuscripts were annotated or glossed. I wanted to just show you some examples from OSU's own collection. And again, I want to encourage you during the course of this talk and afterwards, please feel free to pause. I encourage you to pause and take a longer look at the manuscripts and just let the look and feel of them soak in. Really try to understand how these different glossings and annotations operate. Also, these things are just really nice to look at, so please feel free to admire them. Okay, so there are all sorts of different kinds of glossing and annotations that you'll find in medieval manuscripts. The basic varieties are simple nota bene marks. You're going to see standardized glossing. You'll see reader-added glossing, which is not standardized. This is something that if we all had the same copy of, say, Clemens and Graham, or not the same copy, we all have our own copies of Clemens and Graham, and we annotate them however we want. That's our own reader-added glossing, making absolute unique texts, unique manuscript copies out of things. Suppletive glossing, which is simply adding a missing word. This might be, and actually is pretty closely allied with the insertion method of correction, but it's not quite a correction. It's just you add something for a little bit of extra clarity. Explicative glossing, which is adding a little bit more definition, breaking concepts down, providing more of a framework for understanding the text that is presented on the manuscript page. And then lexical glossing, which is simply, adding definitions to things for that added context. So let's take a look at a few of these. These are nota bene marks from a handful of different OSU manuscripts. Up on the left, we have a circa 1400 English manuscript that is a preacher's manual. On the right, we have Gregory the Great's Pastoralia. On the bottom left, we have on the bottom left, we have what I like to call a poxed manicule from a 1434 is when this manuscript was from, and it's from a text written by a Spanish cardinal named Andres de Escobar. And on the right, we have a little annotation, very pleasant one, pretty ambitious one that's been added, and a really nice nota bene mark that's been added into the margins of pastoral miscellany from the early to mid 15th century. So these are all nota bene marks, and you can see that they take all sorts of different shapes. So in the one on the top left, you simply have an abbreviation for the word nota written in there. The one on the right is what you could call a dipel, if you remember that word from Codicology 3.1 and that lecture about punctuation. And here we just have a little quick, simple mark that draws the reader's eye and allows you to realize there's something of note here, whether it's an authoritative quotation or whether it is just a nice maxim within the text that the reader wants to remember. One of my favorite things to look at in medieval manuscripts, just in terms of idle curiosity and appreciation, are the preponderance of different styles of manicula, or these pointed hands. They can get incredibly ambitious, and I really like the ones in this manuscript because they not only are very distinct in shape and often include these decorative fabric cuffs on the wrists, but the person who added them went through and dotted all of them or poxed them in these red dots to draw further attention to them. And then the one on the right is an extremely ambitious one where we have an important part of the text actually singled out by this blue cross and then this little illustration of a Christ-headed nota bene mark, which says nota de multiplicibus beneficiis Dei Passiones. So note the many benefits of the passion of the Lord. So all sorts of different kinds of nota bene marks. There's really an infinitude of ways that nota benes were added to manuscripts. I encourage you to find all sorts on your own and have fun with it. Standardized glossing. So we saw this manuscript in an earlier lecture, and this is from a glossed Bible produced right around 1125, somewhere from 1125 to 1150. And running down the center of the page in the larger script, you can see in the detail on the right, you can see this a little bit more easily. You can see the larger script, and that is the actual text of the Bible itself. In this case, I believe this is from the Gospel of John. And then on the left and the right, and then in between the lines, you see two different kinds of glossing. You see marginal glossing because it's in the margins, and interlinear glossing because it's between the lines. Very often, interlinear glossing might generally be construed as lexical glossing, where it's just going to be adding quick hit definitions or little explications of vocabulary words and individual concepts. What we see happening here, though, is some lexical, but also we see marginal glossing bleeding into the interlinear glossing and interlinear glossing bleeding out to and informing the marginal glossing. So this really is a complex tapestry of glossing that is not added by a reader. This is all added by the scribe in the scribal workshop in order to produce this scholarly tool. So multiple copies of this manuscript or of this text could have been made in this way, preserving the text of the Bible as well as standard scholarly apparatus around that text of the Bible. In contrast to standardized glossing, we can have reader-added glossing. And this is one of my absolute favorite manuscript pages, manuscript fragments in the entire collection here at Ohio State. One of the things I don't like about doing things on PowerPoint and on a screen, whether it's virtually like this or in the class room itself, is that you get no sense of scale. This is a remarkably small manuscript page, not that you would know that here, but depending on the size of computer you're looking at this lecture on, the tool I'm using to deliver this is a Microsoft Surface, and the image on the left of the full page on my Microsoft Surface tablet screen is still bigger than the actual page itself. So roughly speaking, we have about 13 lines of scribally written text per inch on this page. That's a remarkably compressed text block. And somehow the mid-13th century owner of this book, likely a Dominican friar, managed to add commentary not just in the margins, but between the lines. And I love manuscripts like this because this is where you truly get to see how texts were interpreted and read and used by all sorts of different types of readers. And in this case, what we have here are notes by, again, likely a Dominican friar, possibly a Franciscan friar, but notes that were taken that explicate the prophecy of Hosea, probably for interpretation and reuse within the context of a sermon. Here's an example of simple suppletive glossing, and there's really no interpretation happening here. This is when you simply add something that helps with the grammatical sense of the actual text that's happening here. So in this case, the word essay, to be signaled by this tie mark, is supposed to be inserted after the word religiosus up here on the very end of the top line or the second line, depending on how you're looking at this image. You can just see the tie mark in the very extreme upper right register of this image. So that's simple suppletive glossing. Then you have explicative glossing. So oh, and then also reference mark annotations here. So we'll get to both. Explicative glossing is where you are adding a little bit of definition, a little bit of added context to smaller components of the text. Very often explicative glossing is not going to be long form kind of narrative. This is going to be diagrammatic, not always, but very often can be diagrammatic, kind of like what we see here. And if you look at the very bottom margin of the manuscript page pictured here, you're going to see what's called a distinction, a distinctione, or a distinctio, and the distinctiones plural that you see here. These are not to be confused with distinctiones as punctuation symbols, but distinctions in this context are individual words that are pulled out of, in this case, the biblical text. And you can see on the left of each one of these little tree diagrams, you're going to see an individual vocabulary word from the Bible, and then you have it kicked out into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different meanings and different interpretations for that single word. explicating that particular word and adding all sorts of different layers of interpretation and context. We'll talk a little bit more about the different layers of biblical interpretation when we get to our pastoral care lecture and pastoral care manuscripts later this semester. In addition to this explicative style of glossing, you can also see reference mark annotations. And I referred to this manuscript in the Codicology II lectures, where we looked at these images, or these symbols, I should say, to the absolute left of each one of these columns. And you're going to see these strange symbols. They're not alphabetic symbols, they're reference marks. And I've not really yet been able to interpret the difference between these individual reference marks, but I've managed to reconstruct enough of this fragmentary Bible. It originally was 352 pages. And I found enough of it to now to strongly suggest that what's going on here is this is kind of a twofold system of reference, where the reader, the scholarly reader, or the religious reader who's doing this possibly to construct lectures, possibly to construct sermons, is using this system of reference and these symbols to link to a concordance and a biblical dictionary that appeared at the end of this volume, but then also to group particular concepts and particular words into common groups based on the symbol that he's using. I'm still not convinced of this. I've got more work to do, but it's an interesting personalized system of reference annotation that was used in varying forms by scholars at Oxford in the 13th century. That's the last kind of glossing that I want to show you. Again, I encourage you to go back and pause and really examine closely these manuscripts and take in their various features. Another nice thing that you can do is go through all of these images, thinking about Codicology I and parchment characteristics, Codicology II and the stages of manuscript production, and earlier components of Codicology III. Look for different kinds of punctuation, look for different kinds of grammars of legibility, and try to combine everything that we've been talking about over the last 3 units. Okay, thank you very much for your attention.